Philip, what? Oh, okay.
Your guys' survey told you what the code word is at the bottom.
Oh, interesting. Partner, are we rolling? All right. It's recording. There we are. Okay. Hello, everyone. How many of you were at the last lecture? Okay, most of you? All right. Because this one builds on the last lecture a lot. I'm a little bit concerned for those of you that didn't come that you might be a little lost. So, okay. Anyways, today we're covering the 11th lecture of the DECAL. We'll be talking about the decentralized mixing protocols, fair exchange mixers, as well as some privacy-centric altcoins to continue our discussion of, say, like centralized mixers and altcoin exchange mixing. For those of you that didn't come last time, I'm going to be giving a brief recap of anonymity and to try to quickly build up the mental model of like, okay, why is privacy important? What are some of the basic de-anonymization techniques? Some of the framework. Then I'm going to build up a formal way of thinking about anonymity and reasoning adversarially about privacy and designing your own protocol. Then we have fair exchange mixers, which Philip is going to be talking about, and privacy-focused altcoins by Aparna. All right, so quick recap of what we did last time, because it is pretty complex material. Remember that most of the data in a blockchain is not anonymous by default. It's pseudonymous, meaning that you have some pseudonym, like basically your Reddit account on the Bitcoin blockchain, and that may or may not be linked to your real identity. And the goal of de-anonymization is to link this pseudonym with the real-world identity. And we talked about how Bitcoin best practice has a small degree of anonymity in that every time you receive money, you want to generate a new address. So it's like if you generated a new Reddit account every time you wanted to make a comment. You can see how there's a small degree of privacy there, but using some analysis on the Bitcoin blockchain and of the data there, it basically renders this completely ineffective. And basically, we want to have a really high degree of anonymity so that we can have privacy. But a lot of people ask, is privacy only for drugs? So we talked about some cases where like, oh, you want to pay, you want to go to Bob's Burgers and like, or you go to Walgreens and make a purchase, but then your cashier is able to look up your entire financial history on the blockchain, blockchain.info. Or the example where you have a startup and you want to make a purchase of a competitor's product, but now they know exactly who your customers are, what your input costs are, what your revenue is. And the basic conclusion is that without this anonymity, everyone has a complete history of transactions you've ever made and will know any transactions that you make in the future. This is like a big problem because we wouldn't have our bank statements open and public to the world, right? So we talked about some of the de-anonymization techniques, like, okay, we have this basic level of anonymity in Bitcoin where we want to generate a lot of different pseudonyms. So that means for every person on the network, there's probably a lot of different pseudonyms. So we introduced this idea of clustering where we need to associate these pseudonyms to the same entity. And then after we've clustered these pseudonyms together, like this clump of addresses, we need to now link that clump of addresses to their real-world identity. And we talk about some techniques like, okay, you can infer from the transaction graph that like, oh, hey, look, Mt. Gox has a large volume in 2013. This is probably Mt. Gox. Or tagging individuals and services by like making transactions with them and sending them Bitcoin. Yeah, and then we started getting into anonymization, primarily through mixing. And this is analogous to, remember, the layering step of the traditional money laundering step, basically where you have this money already deposited in these shell corps. And then these shell corporations are just going to continually send money to each other to try to obfuscate this trail of funds so that hopefully you have like clean funds at the end of the process. Now remember that we want, our goal with mixing is to maximize our anonymity set. And the anonymity set is the set of peers between which your pseudonym cannot be distinguished. Like your output address in a set of 30 output addresses in a mix is like one of an anonymity set of like 30. So remember that we can make this anonymity set a lot larger by doing repeated rounds of mixing, and this will like have an exponential increasing, or assuming that everyone you mix with also continues to do mixes. So like 30 people turns to like 900 people, like n squared, n cubed, etc. But there's a lot of real-world constraints in that there's usually a limited number of people who actually want to mix their funds, and a lot of the people that you mix your funds with tend to want to do so for illegal reasons. So you might come out with dirty money anyway. Remember that in whatever approach we use for mixing, we want it to be trustless, meaning that we don't want people to be able to steal our money. And we also want it to be plausibly deniable, meaning that it shouldn't be really obvious from your history that you are mixing, because then that can count as evidence against you in court if someone thinks you're doing something illegal, because the mixing looks very suspicious. Okay, so last time we talked about centralized mixes, where you basically have like some centralized person like run the slush fund, and you send Bitcoins to it, and at some point in the future, they'll send Bitcoins out of it to like your fresh address, and it's a different Bitcoin than the Bitcoin you sent in. We talked about altcoin exchange mixing, where basically you buy some altcoins, you withdraw from the exchange, and then send it to another exchange, and then convert that to a different altcoin, and then you complete this process several times and obfuscate the trail of funds through a chain of disparate blockchains and exchanges. And then now we're going to talk about decentralized mixing. Okay, so some more like really high or general level stuff that's like hard to grasp. The idea behind these decentralized mixing protocols is that we want to remove this counterparty risk by taking out the middleman. And in doing so, we can also avoid fees that would otherwise be paid to the centralized mix or the altcoin exchange. And essentially, we want to make an overlay network on top of the Bitcoin network that's going to allow these peers to mix their funds together, hopefully in a trustless way. Can this be done? And in fact, yes. This is the question that me and Philip sought to answer in our research. So the DMIX project, which was the project that we've done over the last year or so, was basically to try to build a trustless, decentralized mixer that maintains this property of plausible deniability. And we wanted it to be good enough for real-world use. So we didn't want there to be really high fees that would be extremely cost prohibitive. And we also wanted it to be Bitcoin compatible because, believe it or not, there's actually protocols out there proposed that aren't Bitcoin compatible. And it's like, what's the point of doing this? There are some other additional techniques for doing this. But we wanted to focus on Bitcoin because it is the most prolific, it is the most prominent. Lightning Network doesn't yet exist. You can do mixing things with that and other techniques, but we're just going to focus on like an overlay network on top of Bitcoin. Okay, so there's some additional considerations when you want to build a good decentralized mixing protocol. So formally, what you're doing when you're mixing is you have a bunch of inputs, like a bunch of people who want to mix their funds, and then you want to create a new set of outputs, and then hide the mapping from the inputs to the outputs. And then we'll define this property called correctness, which is a stronger property than just being trustless. Like, this is something we want in our mix as well. So in addition to not being able to steal funds in this mix, you also want it to make it so that this permutation between inputs and outputs is completely random, and that no attacker is able to bias this randomness or otherwise de-anonymize the mix or make it work in their favor. So this is where we introduce different adversarial models to think about this, this mix. So first we have like the weakest adversary, which is the passive adversary. And this person is like not a part of the mix. Basically, they're just like some random Joe on the Bitcoin network. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to de-anonymize this mix just by looking at like, oh, the public transaction data. If you have any kind of decent mix, then you are anonymous against the passive adversary. Like, this is a pretty low bar. Then there's the semi-honest adversary, which is actually a participant in your protocol, and they're going to execute all the specifications of your protocol correctly, but they might look at, you know, the history of messages sent. They might look at network messages sent. Otherwise, try to de-anonymize the mix by like looking at the additional information and metadata around it. Generally, this semi-honest adversary is not going to try to steal funds because stealing funds is usually not part of your protocol. And then lastly, we have our malicious adversary, which is kind of like, it's analogous to Byzantine fault tolerance. It's the adversary that can do literally whatever. They can actively deviate from the protocol. They may send false or misleading messages. They may abstain from messages. And they might actively try to either steal the funds or de-anonymize the mix. So we want to be secure against also the malicious adversary. Okay, and then now we've talked about Sybil resistance a little bit throughout this course. Recall that a Sybil attack is basically where you generate a lot of Sybil identities, like a bunch of fake identities to try to subvert some kind of system. And in the context of decentralized mixing, there's a two-part definition. The first is like, okay, we want it to be Sybil resistant against stealing funds. And the implication of this is that you can't use any kind of threshold cryptography where you need, you know, m of n signatures, where like m would be less than n, because that means, say, like I require 29 out of 30 signatures in this mix. If someone manages to get 29 Sybils in this mix, then they're able to steal your money. So that would violate the trustless property. The other definition of Sybil resistance in decentralized mixing is resistance to de-anonymization. So the weak resistance to de-anonymization is basically where these people outside of the mix can't determine the mapping of inputs and outputs, but these participants within the mix can. This is kind of like that passive adversary successfully de-anonymizing the mix. And then there's strong Sybil resistance to de-anonymization where even the passive adversaries, people who participate in this mix, aren't able to learn the mapping from inputs to outputs. And this is a highly desirable property that we want in our protocol. But there's a quick note of that. Even if you have achieved strong Sybil resistance to de-anonymization, you're still able to vastly reduce the anonymity set if you're able to get a lot of Sybil peers into that group. So say I have a mix of 30 people, and I managed to get 26 Sybils into this group. Well, and I'm targeting someone. If that person's funds come to me, then I know exactly where their funds are. If it didn't come to me, then I know it came to one of these 4 remaining nodes that I didn't control in this group. So I've effectively reduced the anonymity set from a size of 30 to a size of 4. This is common to basically any scheme where you're forming a bunch of groups to come together. But there are some ways you can mitigate this by, for example, introducing fees, making it really expensive, or requiring a large amount of capital to do this. Okay, there's some other caveats when talking about decentralized mixing. You want to be careful of side channel attacks. So this is like network analysis. You don't want people to be able to intercept your messages and then be able to tell, oh, okay, now I know the mapping, like this person is, this input maps to this output. So the general assumption is that we use Tor for everything. However, these exit nodes may be adversary controlled, so that might be a worry. Other things that you want to worry about is like analyzing the actual amounts in the transaction. So if I like put in 1337.6969 Bitcoin into a mix, and then 1337.420 Bitcoin comes out, like that might be a little suspicious. Like, so the solution to this is you always want to use some uniform transaction amount across everyone in the mix, and optimally use an amount that is common to the whole network. So I might want to use like 1 Bitcoin or 0.1 Bitcoin, like an amount that you see pretty often on the network. And if you do that, then basically all the transactions going through all of these mixes are going to look the same. Lastly, network level de-anonymization is mostly referring to how this transaction actually propagates the network. So there was some study done in 2014 that showed that, okay, the first node that is informing you of some Bitcoin transaction is usually the actual source of that transaction. So you might want to be careful about like, okay, maybe I want to like relay it to this other like Tor node and then have them broadcast this transaction. Like we want to be impervious to network analysis attacks. Okay, Parna, you should call Philip in case he's asleep. Okay. So now we're going to cover the protocols. So I've talked a lot about the theory, a lot of the ways you can analyze this. Let's actually run through a bunch of examples. And through this, we're going to build up an entire history of, the like accumulative history of the research on decentralized Bitcoin mixing. So first, we start off with CoinJoin, which was proposed by Greg Maxwell in 2011. And it's pretty simple. It's basically you have a bunch of inputs, and you're going to make this one giant transaction where you need n of n signatures to then go to these n outputs. So like 30 inputs, everyone signs, 30 outputs. So the main benefit of this is that it's trustless. Like that's a very like it's simple, but it's a very powerful property because that means that you're able to build on top of CoinJoin, like use CoinJoin as a primitive for other mixing protocols. Some of the cons of this is that it's not secure against the passive, it's not secure against a passive adversary. For example, whenever you're actually doing this CoinJoin transaction, everyone has their Bitcoin. They're like, okay, I want to send it to this output. But how do you actually form this transaction? You need to tell someone, right? And the general implementation of this is to have this some kind of implementation or central server. And in doing so, this central server is able to learn the mapping from inputs to outputs. So that's why it's not secure against a passive adversary. And it's also vulnerable to traffic analysis. Like if someone is able to intercept the packets that you're sending to this centralized server, then they can learn, okay, this is the mapping from this particular input to this particular output. It's also not plausibly deniable. So recall that I say, okay, in the CoinJoin transactions, there's like 30 inputs, 30 outputs. Like who spends Bitcoin like that? Like who spends from 30 inputs and then goes to 30 outputs? So you can easily spot it on the blockchain. That's why it's not plausibly deniable. And it's also not denial of service attack resistant because say I have a CoinJoin transaction that has 100 inputs and 100 outputs. If only one person in that mix decides to, okay, I'm just going to start this transaction, but then I'm not going to follow through, then they ruin it for everyone else. And then they can effectively halt the protocol. So you probably know about Dash. Dash uses CoinJoin as a primitive to build a privacy-focused altcoin. And the big plus of using CoinJoin on Dash is that everyone mixes their coins using CoinJoin by default. So this solves the plausible deniability problem because everyone is making these weird, n of n transactions. The main cons with Dash is if you like all the drawbacks of CoinJoin, but also if you don't trust the Dash network itself. So Dash has like a network of masternodes where it costs 1,000 Dash to own a masternode, and these masternodes are the ones that actually conduct these CoinJoin transactions. So if you can overtake a large number of them, you could de-anonymize the Dash network. Okay, so COINSHUFFLE came out in 2014, and it wants to build on top of CoinJoin, make it a lot better. So its main contribution is to build a better communication protocol to resolve these traffic analysis attacks and to make it decentralized. But in this decentralized scheme, you still need some way to come up with a random permutation, like a random mapping from inputs to outputs. And to do that, they use something called a decryption MIXNET, which is basically where a bunch of people can come together and do like a secure multi-party computation on this shuffling and to jointly compute this permutation. The benefits of this is that, it uses this protocol called DECENT, which basically makes it so that whenever you send a message, you can't tell who sent that message, and this allows you to anonymously communicate your outputs in this mix. And it's anonymous against this mixed facilitator because there is no mixed facilitator. And therefore, it also achieves strong Sybil resistance against de-anonymization. The drawback to this is that it still has all the drawbacks of CoinJoin, in particular that it's vulnerable to de-anonymization using a Sybil attack, getting a lot of peers into this group, and still vulnerable to the denial of service attack. And there's actually a small flaw in the CoinShuffle protocol where when you're doing this decryption mixnet to try to compute this permutation of inputs to outputs, the last peer in that decryption mixnet is able to, has like a way to bias this, this permutation. And they're effectively able to control this permutation, which could defeat the purpose of this mix. So I keep on talking about this decryption mixnet. This is a particularly powerful primitive because, like I said, it is oblivious among the peers that, that participate in this decryption mixnet. And basically how it works is you have you have all your output addresses, right? You then encrypt it with person C's public key, then encrypt it with person B, then encrypt it with person A. So then at this point, only person A is able to decrypt this blob of data. So you pass it to person A, and then they decrypt it. Then they're going to apply some kind of private permutation to these remaining blobs, and then pass it on to the next person, who then decrypts, applies another private permutation, etc., until you get to this last person who decrypts the last layer, and then that is the jointly computed permutation for this decryption mixnet. All right. So to talk a little bit more about how these protocols exist in the real world, JOINMARKET tries to solve this liquidity problem because all of these, like I said earlier, there might be a limited number of people in the network who want to actually mix their funds. So CoinJoin basically tries to incentivize them by okay, I'll pay you a small fee if you open up your funds for mixing. The issues with this is that the anonymity set is still fairly small because there's not enough incentive to actually mix your funds because CoinJoin is trustless, there's very little risk. So why do I need to pay that person that much money for these funds? And because it uses CoinJoin, it's not it's not resistant to de-anonymization by a passive adversary. So that means you only need one Sybil in each mixing group to de-anonymize the entire network, right? So there was a study done by these guys, Moser and Bohm, who showed that using a capital amount of around $32,000, you can basically de-anonymize the whole JOINMARKET ecosystem, and at basically zero risk because it's trustless, and you get all your money back. Yeah, so that's some of the issues. CoinParty. Okay, so all of these ones that we talked about so far, CoinJoin and CoinShuffle, they are using this giant N-of-N multi-signature transaction. It looks very obvious on the blockchain. What CoinParty tries to do is it tries to build this protocol with way better plausible deniability, and better to the point where every transaction just looks like any normal Bitcoin transaction. So they are able to achieve this, but then in doing so, they need to sacrifice some protocol security, which we'll see in a moment. So how CoinParty works is, okay, we have all our inputs, we have all our funds that we want to anonymize. We're going to generate as a group, a bunch of public-private key pairs. And these public-private key pairs are going to correspond to these escrow addresses where we want to send these funds. And the key thing about these key pairs is that, okay, each of these private keys is split into a bunch of shares so that, and these shares are distributed among the peers in this mixing group. So there's no one person who is able to spend all the funds from this escrow address. In particular, you need 2/3 of the people, 2/3 of the shareholders to come together to be able to spend from this escrow address. So it uses a threshold signature. That's basically how it achieves looking like a Bitcoin transaction, because under the hood it's still a public key and a private key, but what's actually happening is this private key is split among a lot of people. So you send these funds to the escrow addresses, then you're going to execute this decryption mixnet to obliviously and jointly compute a input-output shuffling, and then finally you just send from these escrow addresses to the output addresses that you had just computed the permutation for. In addition, there's a error and reversion phase. So if there's any kind of malicious behavior detected in the first 3 phases, then they can basically steal all the funds of that person who is being malicious. So the benefits of this, like I said, is it's very high plausible deniability, and because these look like normal Bitcoin transactions, the anonymity set is not just the network of groups mixing with COINPARTY. It's actually the size of the entire Bitcoin network that has this particular transaction amount, because it looks like normal transactions. And it also has decent efficiency in that it only requires 2 on-chain transactions, from the input to the escrow and then escrow to the output, versus some other protocols that might require 4 or even more, or might take hours to execute. The con of COINPARTY is, as you may recall, we can't use threshold signatures where you have m less than n signing on some funds. Because COINPARTY uses threshold signatures that's set at 2/3, that means if you get a bunch of Sybils into this group, then you're effectively able to steal everyone's money. So COINPARTY is not trustless. Yeah, and therefore it's not feasible for real-world use. Okay. Oh, Jesus. Okay, I guess I can present this on the fly. All right, so fair exchange mixers. It looks like Philip is missing today, but I'll just go off my memory. Okay, so basically these fair exchange mixers are trustless mixers, but usually refers to some model where you have a bunch of a person paying another person through some intermediary. So it is centralized, but the thing is, this intermediary isn't trusted. So for example, in this diagram, Alice can create these new funds. She's going to then take it to the mixer, who's going to give her a voucher, and then later on she can go back and redeem this voucher for some clean coins that would be different from the coins that she originally put in. The key thing about all of these fair exchange mixers is that you need a very high volume of transactions moving through this intermediary. Otherwise, this intermediary is able to associate you with these timing attacks. So say Alice wants to send her funds through this intermediary. Well, the intermediary doesn't see anything, but they see one voucher coming in, one voucher coming out. I bet that's the same person. So this is kind of the underlying assumption of all these fair exchange mixers. Building upon this model, let's see what we can do. So CoinSwap uses so-called hash-locked 2-of-2 multi-sig transactions. Basically, you need 2 out of 2 signatures to make a transaction in this, and it allows you to securely swap your coins with someone else in this network. This is a really powerful primitive because, one, it's trustless, and it's also it has a fair degree of plausible deniability because it's using standard 2-of-2 multi-sig transactions, which are fairly common on the network, common enough on the network, I should say. But the thing is, it's not secure against a mixed passive intermediary. So the intermediary that you're using in this CoinSwap would learn this, but you could just be using CoinSwap like you could be swapping with the intermediary itself, and you can't really avoid them knowing like where your funds came from. So that's generally okay. Another downside to CoinSwap is that it's kind of expensive in that it uses 4 transactions, 4 on-chain transactions for every swap that you do. So yeah, so this is basically what CoinSwap looks like on the blockchain in the case where like, oh, both parties are fair. There's a lot of like security mechanisms to tell like, okay, if someone cheats, then we have this other Bitcoin script that allows you to punish that other person and still get your money back. Now we talk about, okay, ZIM and BSC. So ZIM is another fair exchange mixer. And it basically tries to avoid this problem of like denial of service and civil attacks by introducing fees. So essentially what you do is like, okay, we don't want someone to be able to just target someone else. Like I want to repeatedly mix with this person so I always know where their funds are, right? So they have a protocol where you basically broadcast onto the blockchain like, hey, I want to mix my funds. And then several hours later, someone gets matched with you. And then it's like, okay, now we can mix our funds together. But this is like extremely impractical. Like in the paper, they say that it takes like 4 hours, but like in practice, it takes like 26 to 30 hours, which is a long time to be waiting for your money for like an anonymity set increase of size 1. So what blindly signed contracts do, it's basically trying to resist these denial of service and civil attacks using something called fee vouchers. So you like pay these fee vouchers. I'm not too familiar with this protocol, but it does avoid the really time-consuming group forming process. However, blindly signed contracts is not practical in a different way in the sense that the scripting functionality that it uses is not actually integrated into Bitcoin. It relies on something called bilinear pairings, elliptic curve pairings, which is not a part of the elliptic curve digital signature algorithm used by Bitcoin. Okay, so TUMBLEBIT is the state-of-the-art in fair exchange mixers. It came out in 2016, and it basically improves on it on blindly signed contracts, BSC, to make it Bitcoin compatible. Their key innovation is they have some kind of like RSA evaluation as a service protocol to make this work within the confines of this Bitcoin framework. And this is basically the only mix that I think is fairly feasible for real-world use because it is trustless. If you have a high enough volume of transactions moving through this intermediary, you have achieved anonymity. Yeah, we're actually talking with TUMBLEBIT right now to, and they helped us a little bit on our research to come up with like a scheme to solve our group forming problem because we were having this civil attack problem as well. Oh yeah, okay, so that comes to the conclusion of me and Philip's research. So the last iteration of our research was what we called the swinger protocol because that was literally the best real-world analogy we could come up for it. So basically what you do is you come together into a group and then you form pairs, just whoever, it doesn't matter. You designate one person in the pair as the husband and the other person as the wife. So as a pair, you're going to execute this decryption mixnet to jointly and obliviously compute a input-output mapping. So now you have another pair that like has been the output of that algorithm. So then you send your wife to that pair, and then you receive some wife from some other pair, and then the husbands and wives will swap. So because we build on CoinSwap for the swapping part, it's trustless. And because we use this decryption mixnet, we have civil resistance to de-anonymization against like the passive adversary. So yeah, currently nothing that really exists like meets our set design goals. What we have comes close, but the thing is like we were not sure if we wanted to actually publish this paper because in the naive scheme, you could just randomly swap with people on the Bitcoin network. And so long you have swapped with someone who isn't targeting you, then you have achieved anonymity. We've talked about, okay, in this mixing group, we have this problem of when you introduce a bunch of civil peers, you can reduce the anonymity set. then Ethan Heilman of TUMBLEBIT like advised us, hey, like you could use something called a unlinkable or linkable ring signature across the inputs that you're spending from. So everyone comes into a group and they basically do a proof that, hey, the inputs that I'm putting into this is one of the ones in this group, but I'm not going to reveal which one it is. And if everyone does like this ring signature over all the others in the group, no one knows whose money came in where. And you can require a large amount of capital to then participate in this mix, which would allow you to kind of solve this, partially solve this civil resistance problem. Okay, are we on time? Okay. All right. Oh, yeah.
The linkable ring signature thing, if everyone has to participate, can you still get DOS?
If linkable ring signatures,
DOS resistant?
yeah, I think it would still be DOS resistant. Yeah. Usually we don't worry too much about DOS because you can just kick that node out and then do a mix with the remaining peers. Yeah. Actually, quick note: Monero uses linkable ring signatures because actually, wait, Aparna is going to be talking about that. That's right. Okay. Yeah. All right.
Hi. So I'll be talking about privacy-focused altcoins. The issue with mixing so far is it's been hard on the Bitcoin network. So someone came up with the idea of building in anonymity into the coins, which is where like privacy-focused altcoins came in. So the first privacy-focused altcoin that I'm going to talk about is Monero, which is built on the CRYPTONOTE protocol. Unlike a lot of other altcoins, which are forks of Bitcoin, Monero is actually a fork of a CRYPTONOTE-based currency called Bitcoin. The basic idea behind Monero is you want to provide untraceability and unlinkability of transactions. What that basically means is you want to hide the addresses of the senders and the receivers. Untraceability basically means hiding the addresses of all the senders. How Monero does it is it uses something called ring signatures. So a transaction in Monero, like if you were going to have a transaction in Monero, you would choose a set of previous outputs that you want to mix with. And these are then bound with your own outputs in a ring signature. And a ring signature is basically a mathematical term for like a proof where you prove that your output is one of those outputs, but you can't pinpoint which one it is. And because anonymity is built into Monero as a currency, there's no issue of plausible deniability. Monero provides unlinkability through creating these one-time payment channels. And we'll take a look at all of those right now. So this is an example of untraceability in Monero through ring signatures. So if you recall, in a normal, like in a Bitcoin signature scheme, you have one signer and one verifier. But in this case, if you encounter a ring signature with Alice, Bob, Carol, and Dave, Romulus knows that he's getting an input from either Alice, Bob, or Carol, but he doesn't know from which one. And Alice, Bob, or Carol can prove that they have sent their output, and it belongs to one of these senders. You use untraceability to hide the sender's transactions, but you can still like trace where the money is going to. So you need to use unlinkability to hide Romulus and Remus's addresses. And we'll take a look at that. So if you remember a normal Bitcoin network, all the input transactions and input addresses and output addresses are visible. So if Bob didn't want his address to be visible, he could just create multiple public addresses for each transaction that he makes. The issue with this is he loses the convenience of having like one single account where he stores all of his money or transactions. So what Monero does is creates these multiple temporary one-time addresses for Bob, which are all linked to his address. And once any peer-to-peer transaction happens, these vanish. Some pros of Monero are there is no other coin which has this much of like mathematical proof behind their anonymity. Like Monero uses concepts like ring signatures and Diffie-Hellman codes, which have been like age-old mathematical concepts. Actually, just today in the morning, there is a paper released on how 80% of transactions in Monero are linkable. So rip that. The cons of Monero are it doesn't really hide your transaction values. It only hides the addresses. And if you recall, your anonymity set for your ring signatures are only those who you choose to mix with. So you could have a better anonymity set. The next iteration of that is ZCASH or ZK snarks. ZCASH uses this bleeding edge crypto called ZK snarks, which are basically zero knowledge, succinct, non-interactive arguments of knowledge, also called crypto magic. ZK snarks are basically proofs that you know something without revealing what you actually know. So how does Zcash implement these proofs into its cryptocurrency? It has a layered system where you could have a base coin, like an input A, which has completely transparent transactions. You would take that coin and then mint it with minting procedures to create a Zcash black box coin. All the transactions that then happen inside the Zcash black box are completely anonymous. Like your input-output addresses are hidden, and your input-output transaction values are also hidden. And anytime you wanted to redeem your base coin from this Zcash black box coin, you would do what's called a pour. So we'll take a closer look at that. If you recall, any transaction in Bitcoin looks like what's above. For any transaction to happen in any network, you need to prove three things. The first is the input hasn't been spent. The second is the sender actually owns the input. And the third is that the sum of inputs is equal to the sum of outputs. As you can see in Bitcoin, just by taking a look at the ledger, you would have proof of all three. Whereas Zcash replaces your input addresses and your input values, transaction values, with a zero knowledge proof. And your output is basically the details, which could be like polynomial functions or anything else, which are required to reconstruct the zero knowledge proof with the receiver's key. So Zcash basically has a two-layered system. One is your transparent layer, and the second is your zero knowledge security layer. So Zcash was actually like a fork of Bitcoin. So the reason you have a transparent layer and the secure layer is users are already like familiar with Bitcoin, and if they want transparency, they should be allowed to have that. And second, since Bitcoin's already been implemented, it's easier to integrate Zcash with existing technologies like Bitcoin. if you have this transparent layer. The cool thing about Zcash is like you can not only have transactions within your transparent layer or within your zero knowledge secure layer, but also like between layers. So if you wanted to do like a transaction from your transparent layer to your secure layer, then you would be hiding the output addresses and output values, but your inputs would still be visible, and vice versa. You should really take a look at the Zcash blog. They go into some of the cool mathematical intricacies of this. Yeah. So here's a peek behind the Zcash black box. So ZK snarks use functions called homomorphic functions, which basically have the following three properties. One is if you have, if we are given an output, it should be hard to find the input to that function. The second is different inputs should lead to different outputs, and ideally those outputs are unique. The third is if we know the outputs of two different input values, we can find the output of the function on some arithmetic combination like addition of the two inputs without knowing the input values. So to exemplify what I mean, Alice has two numbers, x and y, such that x plus y is equal to 7. Alice doesn't want to reveal these numbers to Bob, but she wants to prove to Bob that x plus y is equal to 7. So Alice takes x and y and puts them in a homomorphic function and sends the encrypted values over to Bob. So Bob now has f of x and f of y. Bob can find f of x plus y just knowing the values of f of x and f of y, which is basically what property 3 says. And then Bob should be able to check if f of x plus y is equal to f of 7. And if that's true, then Bob is convinced. That's based off like different inputs leading to different output values, and these different outputs have a unique value. So some pros of Zcash are it uses bleeding edge cryptography, and assuming that this cryptography is true, you have completely anonymized transactions. Another pro is it can be integrated with any consensus mechanism or algorithm, like not just proof of work, but also like proof of stake, any of the other ones which we learned of. Some cons are it is resource intensive. So a ZK snark proof currently in use can take like 4 gigabytes of RAM or 40 seconds of computation on a CPU, and you don't want to be running that on your mobile phone. It also requires a semi-trusted one-time setup. So for Zcash to function, these ZK snarks need to have a one-time cryptographic setup. And during this setup, toxic parameters in the form of private keys are generated, and if these are not destroyed properly, an adversary who gains access to these can basically create counterfeit coins and spend them. So he's basically like printing money. This can be sort of mitigated with a secure multi-party setup. In the Zcash ceremony, they had like all the founders come together and destroy their keys. The only thing is you're assuming that they're not secretly colluding. Another con is it assumes security at the network level when that's not really the case. Okay, conclusions.
Are we on time? I think we might have to end. Oh yeah, I have like 30 seconds.
Okay.
Okay, so if I were to quickly recap kind of the comparative level of anonymity that we've covered in these last 2 lectures. First, you have like Bitcoin best practice using a new address for every Bitcoin that you receive. Then you have the centralized mixers and decentralized mixing protocols. If you were to ask me, how would I mix my coins today? I would actually use altcoin exchange mixing, and although it's not the most elegant solution, I do think it's the best. In particular, you have to do this over Tor and a VPN. I would generate a new throwaway email address every time, go to a different exchange each time. Make sure to obfuscate like my identity across each of those exchanges. And I'd probably do it across Dash, Monero, and ZCASH. In particular, because like ZCASH is literally anonymous at the mathematical level. Like there's nothing at like the transaction graph level that can reveal anything about like your transactions. Yeah.
How would you do that on like exchanges that require like identification?
Yeah, the question is how would I do that on exchanges that require identification? Most exchanges, when you're only trading cryptocurrency pairs, you don't actually need any identification. I guess I would just avoid those. And also there's an exchange called Shapeshift where you can basically just send coins with no account and trustlessly receive coins out. Okay, so we'll probably be sending out a survey for next week's lecture on what you guys want to hear about. It's our advanced topics lecture, and we use it to basically cover anything random you guys are interested in. Thanks.
Yeah, please respond to the survey like ASAP, like,
Yeah.
so that we can fit the lecture.
See like multiple more into it.
We are working on it.
Oh,
I mean, we basically solved the problem.
okay.
We can solve the problem.
Oh, you're saying
And then now we're
mostly covering requirements. You guys you're mostly covering requirements.
what do you mean?
Like all the things it needs to be.
Yeah.
Jesus.
Like what?
Say you
I don't know. It's okay. I actually see you guys later.
I usually I don't really
There's no problem at all. So this is the one.
Yeah, I mean, I was like, I like a part of it like 30 years ago. I don't think bad at like I've seen that since but at least this is like the one lecture you make. Give my son.
Hey, you made it.
You made it in time.
I actually should have like 10 minutes ago, but wow, we haven't done
Yeah. Dude, I got Lightning Network.
nice. For the interview?
Yeah. Or, I mean, I got the job.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, yeah. I'm so excited. Holy shit. Also, they wanted me to relay to you, like, their main concern is not having to, like, use up a month of Lalu's time to onboard you. So they said, like, if you're able to submit like a decent pull request,
Yeah.
then they're probably gonna interesting. So if you want to go ham on Saturday,
Just like crush.
yeah. So that's why you should finish our project.